Calling in. How's it going in Denver?
Hey man, just trying to enjoy the snow as much as I can. It's super cold today. How's it back in the Ville?
Definitely not snowing, I'll tell you that. But not the best weather, kind of muggy and rainy. But
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. The cool thing about the snow here is I get to drive out west and go snowboarding in it. Back in the Ville, there's really not much to do when it's cold and crappy outside. So
yeah. So I want to kind of jump in. I wanted to ask, where did your passion for engineering begin?
yeah, so I'll take you all the way through my journey. When I was in high school and I came to speak to St. X and how it influenced my career. When I first started high school, I was actually more like into the arts. I did theater my freshman year. I was interested in like creative writing. I played in a rock band, so music, things like that. I was always good at math, but I was always one of those kids that would ask that age old question, when would I ever use this? Um, and sophomore year, I vividly remember once I started putting math to shapes and patterns and objects is when I started to realize like the physicality that math can bring. And it was super interesting from there on out. And then I felt like I kind of leveled up even more junior year when I took my first physics class. And and in there, you're solving calculus equations or whatever algebraic equations to find speeds and distances and temperatures and voltages, and that's how the world operates on those physical principles. So that just unlocked like the art of the possible for me on how math can actually be applied to change our world. uh, but I knew I didn't want to be a physicist because um, just a lot of research and writing papers. I wanted to put my physical knowledge to use, and that's kind of where I found the field of engineering. You kind of use the physics and mathematical principles you learn to be creative, right? That other side of the brain I talked about in the very beginning. Maybe I'm not writing songs or a novel or something, but I'm creating inventions, right? New possibilities for our species, even when you're talking at the aerospace level. Um, I'll try to fast forward a little bit. Didn't know what type of engineering I wanted to do. So I did mechanical because it was the most broad. Um, I always say, like, NASA would hire a mechanical engineer. Um, Wait, I think I got that wrong. Can you edit these, by the way?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Okay. Well, then I'm going to take a pause. How long of a podcast do you typically run? I don't want to go over.
Like 20 to 30, but
Oh, quick. Okay.
it's your choice, so it's not.
Okay. I'll just keep talking then. All right. Let me try that again. So what I learned was, like, let's say a petroleum company would hire a mechanical engineer, but NASA wouldn't hire a petroleum engineer. So mechanical engineering was what I felt could be the most broad when I was exploring my career options. I actually worked 2 summers down in Houston on an oil rig. Speaking of that, because I was pretty hyper focused on the money. I was a broke high school kid and broke college kid too. When I got my first internship, I was like, "Show me the money." Realized I hated it, but I did get to visit NASA's Johnson Space Center, where I learned about the shuttle program, the International Space Station, and all this really cool stuff. In particular, stuff that humans do in space. And I found my passion there. I went to speed school in Louisville, and after 22 years, I decided I need to see something different. So on a whim, I had never even visited the state. I enrolled at the University of Colorado Boulder. Honestly, like 70% because of the mountains. I've always been an outdoorsman, but 30% because it was a good engineering school, and in particular, a good aerospace engineering school. And it was one of the few institutions in the country that offered what's called bioastronautics, which is short and fancy for the study and support of life in space, or basically how we design for astronauts. Um, it was pretty easy transition from there. Lockheed Martin is NASA's prime contractor for the Orion crew capsule, which is NASA's next generation spacecraft, crewed spacecraft, I should say. that's going to go to the moon and return, humanity to another planetary body. And they're located right here in Denver. So I didn't want to leave the city. I didn't want to leave the industry. It was just a perfect match. Um, so fast forward 3.5 years later, I do the life support systems on Orion. Um, when the crew's on board, they're going to need to breathe. They're going to need to drink water. They're going to need to use the facilities, and they're going to need a nice pressurized, comfortable environment. So anything that what I term turns a tin can into a lifeboat in space is what I design. So
So
long-winded answer to your question.
yeah. So going back to, you talked about petroleum. Um, what were some sort of things that attracted you to go into that first?
Yeah, so really, if it was maybe the prestige and the money, and this is really like the blinders I had when I was 19 years old. I mean, you're kind of short-sighted and you don't quite know what you want to do. Let me think back to those days. I had been in Louisville my whole life, and they offered me a position in Houston, and that was the first time I would get to live out of state. They were paying like double what all the other internships were paying, even if the internships were cooler. Looking back, I actually got a counter offer from GE Aerospace up in Cincinnati to do like 3D printing on their jet engines. Maybe I should have done that, but they paid like half as much, and I was young and broke and stupid. So I went down there. I wasn't particularly interested in the oil industry. In fact, like I wanted to be an engineer to prove the art of the possible and be on the cutting edge. And that was like the exact opposite. I think that refinery was over 100 years old, just keeping the oil flowing, as they say, rather than inventing new technology. Um, so if I'm being honest, new location and a lot of money to move there, but definitely not passion, which is why I don't think I lasted.
So from there, how'd you sort of end up working at Lockheed Martin? Because that's like a really prestigious company. That's a like, to me, that sounds like a big jump. So was that for you? Was that a big jump?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, you can cut or whatever. When I was down in Houston, even though I didn't like the oil rig, it was in Houston, which is the hub of NASA's human spaceflight program. That's where the Johnson Space Center is. Houston, we have a problem. Probably heard that before from Apollo 13. And actually, it was funny how life works out. I was in a volleyball league at like a local gym, and one of the guys on my team was a security officer at the NASA Johnson Space Center and offered me a tour. I mean, I wasn't disinterested. I was an engineer, I wanted, space is cool, right? So I went, and because he was a security guy, he had access to like all the doors. And I got to sit in the flight director's seat of Gene Kranz, who was the flight director for the Apollo missions. I got to see the neutral buoyancy lab where astronauts actually suit up entirely and submerge themselves to practice their spacewalks. And it just really inspired me, that filled that void that I think I was looking for, that passion, right? Um, so fast forward, after my mechanical engineering degree, I didn't really have any aerospace experience. All my experience was with oil and gas. So I enrolled at CU Boulder again in their bioastronautics program to learn how to build space habitats, space suits, and basically how to advance our presence in space.
So once you got to Lockheed Martin, did you choose to work on Orion? Because I know Lockheed Martin does a lot of different things. Was that something that you wanted to do, or just did you just land there?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they are the largest aerospace company in the state for sure. I'm not going to say in the world, but they're definitely top five. And so I knew they had the Orion contract, and I knew I eventually wanted to be on it. And if any like high schoolers or college kids are listening, I would say I cannot overemphasize the value of internships. Because 9 times out of 10, if you're a good performer, they will offer you a job post employment. So the summer in between my two graduate years, I applied to anything and everything that Lockheed had to offer as an internship that I might be qualified for because I saw the bigger picture. I knew if I could at least get my foot in the door, I could end up on Orion. So to answer your question, like I had my finish line in sight, but I didn't just arrive there. I actually did an internship working for corporate and connected the dots while I was there, made those connections to ultimately land Orion as my first real big boy full-time job.
Gotcha. And so you're in the job, right? What does a typical day look like for you? Is it hectic or is it pretty calm?
Yeah, it's fighting fires is what it is for the most part. Um, we run tests often for our life support systems because we want to ensure when the hardware and software are integrated on the real vehicle that nothing unexpected happens, either during test or worse during flight. So here in Denver, we have what's called the Integration Test Lab. We have a big kind of guts of Orion, like this big lab. It looks like Orion, the same shape and everything, just none of the pretty coatings or panels or anything, but it's the same computers, the same cabling, everything like that, same software. And we'll run tests there over and over again to try to catch any bugs so that the real vehicle doesn't experience the same thing. So what's the day in the life look like? They might be running a test and say, oh no, this pump that's supposed to cool our cabin is spinning too fast. Why is that? I'll get on the phone, I'll look at the data. Sometimes I'm in the lab myself. I was just there yesterday. And I'll kind of analyze why we're seeing this anomaly and then track down the right people to help fix it, whether that's like a hardware subject matter expert, a software engineer, things like that. Another thing I do, kind of the second prong to my job, is I build and test all the crew displays. So just like I'm looking at my phone right now, the astronauts are going to be looking at displays when they're in flight to tell them all the pertinent data of how their vehicle is performing, things like altitude, speed, right? And it's important how we display that information to them. If it's like a cautionary message, maybe we want it blinking, maybe we want it yellow to draw their eye to it. Where do we want it positioned, Um, so I also design, integrate, tests all the life support displays on board. And astronaut conversation is a huge part of that process because I don't know. I'm going to take my best judgment, but they've flown. So they hop on the phone with me on a weekly basis and go over my displays, and we iterate from there based on their crew experience, their flight experience.
Can you recall any like major challenges or roadblocks you ran into when you were kind of like in the early phases of this?
Yeah. Um, Really, it was like trying to drink the ocean through a straw. I mean, uh, when you take on a project this big, you cannot learn this in school, and that's probably true of most jobs. It's like I tried my best to prepare. I went to a very specialized graduate school in human spaceflight, but I still felt like an imposter. I mean, I think if anyone doesn't feel imposter syndrome in their first role, they're not being challenged enough. I was basically given a manual of like 300 pages called the ConOps of how Eclipse is supposed to operate with more acronyms than you'd imagine. And it took me a long time to like chug through that. And I really had no idea what I was even talking about. But but I think the reason that I got over the imposter syndrome and ended up successful was maybe I wasn't always the smartest person in the room, but I was smart enough to know who was and who I need to pull together to make things happen. So very early on in my career, if I had no idea about the content I was dealing with, I made sure someone in the room could speak for me or I could ask them the questions to ultimately get the right answer. Um, Everything is a people problem if you really boil it down. You just need the right people in there to help you if you don't know. And early on, I definitely leaned on those people a little more heavily. So don't be shy and don't be afraid to look stupid. That's how you eventually look smart and get over the imposter syndrome.
So I want to move on to more like the whole project as a whole, because some of our listeners probably don't even know what we're talking about with Artemis and Orion. But so can you explain like the role of the Artemis program and the overall like moving humanity out into the solar system?
Yeah, absolutely. So often I get the question, or people criticize NASA by saying, "Why are we going to the moon? We've been there before." Well, let me tell you why. The advancement of technology is not a given. It doesn't happen on its own. The ancient Egyptians built the pyramids, right? And then their society collapsed, and we forgot. We don't know how they did it. We forgot. Some say aliens. um, the ancient Romans built these aqueducts that were so advanced, and then their society collapsed, and we forgot how to do it. The same thing has happened with lunar space exploration. We did it in the 60s, we did it fast to beat the Russians, and then we kind of forgot how to do it. I mean, all the scientists of that era are probably dead and gone, maybe some lingering around in their 90s, right? But since we didn't maintain a presence of lunar exploration, we simply lost those skills. And when we did it for the first time, we touched down. I'm sure everyone knows the Eagles landed, Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong, and we made our mark to win the space race because it was the first to the moon that JFK proclaimed in '62, I believe. And we did it. But then we stopped caring in the early '70s. The Vietnam War was raging, civil unrest, Martin Luther King, things like that. People stopped caring about space and tax dollars to space. The threat of Russia in space was kind of gone, and so was public interest in it. So we didn't learn really much about lunar geography. We didn't learn about our origins in space. Could there have been life on Mars? Could there have been, I'm sorry, the moon? Could there be, has there ever been water on the moon? Is there still trapped in ice on the polar caps, right? So we need to go back and maintain a presence via habitation, rovers that allow us to get, to further less accessible places. And then we can go further into our solar system. We have maintained a constant presence on the International Space Station for over 20 years. But the International Space Station is only 300 miles above the Earth's surface. It only takes about 5 hours to get back if something were to happen. I think there's no comm delay. You talk to them from Houston, they're going to hear you immediately. The moon is 300,000 miles away. So I think there's maybe a 5-second lag, not too hard to work with, but a 5-day return. So if something goes wrong, you better be ready to hunker down. Mars, 300 million miles away, 6 months one way to get there. So if we want to eventually get to Mars, become an interplanetary species, we need to learn how to do it in our own backyard first, right? Because the lessons we learn there will help us as we venture further and further into our solar system. That's why it's important.
So like in general, where do you see like NASA's space program going in the next like 10, 20, even maybe like 50 to 100 years from now?
Right. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure we maintain this presence on the moon. That's going to happen, I hope, indefinitely, just like we maintain our space station and we're doing other things. I hope that we can have a lunar colony that can continue to be habited and expanded. But definitely the next 5 to 10 years is going to help us get there. So I know a lot of you probably saw the Artemis 1 launch a couple months back. Geez, when was that? Yeah, I guess it was 2 months ago. That was uncrewed, but it was the first flight of our Orion vehicle around the moon to prove that we can do it. The next one is 2 years away, we hope, that will have people on board but not touch down. And then I'm taking a wild guess, maybe 2 years from there, we're going to touch down for the first, not the first time, but the first time with the Artemis program, where a lander will descend, basically dock with Orion and descend down to the lunar surface to do experiments. And then I would say, man, if I could take my best guess, the next 10 to 20 years we'll be expanding on that, more habitats, more power plants, fuel generators, so we can get home, without having to lug it all there. I'm thinking there's going to be water reclamation sources where we can basically use the water ice on the moon to create water instead of, again, bringing it all with us because that's heavy and expensive. I envision, again, habitation, roving vehicles, and it's going to be like a human robotic partnership because I like this example, but I don't know the numbers off the top of my head. I think the Mars rover, one of the Mars Curiosity, I believe, that's all done robotically, and people say, well, why can't we just send robots to the moon? Well, the comm delay, remember, like I said, with Mars is on the order of hours. And so if you get a video feedback of Curiosity and you want to move it in this direction, you hit enter on your keyboard or something, right? It's going to move, let's say, 2 feet. Wait a couple hours to make sure you didn't hit a rock. Okay, turn right. 2 hours later, you find out that, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Whereas a human being in the loop can make such more dynamic decisions. So it's important that we have our robotic friends too, to do things in the harsh environment of space that maybe we can't do. But it's going to be a partnership because humans are so tactile and our feedback is so quick that we'll be working alongside them thereafter. And then to finish off your question, 50, 100 years, Mars will be in our sights. If I'm being honest, I don't know if it'll be in our lifetimes, but it's inevitable that it will come. I hope it's in the next 50 years, but I think that's a little optimistic. It's really hard. to get there. 6 months in a minivan, basically, while you're being bombarded with radiation from space, and you'll almost definitely get cancer. Like, we need solutions, like engineering solutions that we haven't even invented yet to go. So, will it happen? Yes. When? Couldn't tell you. No less than 30 years. I would bet on that. And then from there, as far as we can go, I guess. I don't think we're ever going to stop. It's in our blood.
All right, man. Well, thanks for calling in. I really appreciate it. Thanks for taking some time to do this.
Yeah, my pleasure. I love sharing what we're doing over here, and I hope that some of you guys listening to this might follow a similar career trajectory.